Hey everyone, and welcome to today's talk on the blockchain interoperability. Blockchain interoperability allows data and value to be transferred across different networks. It has become an increasingly important feature of Web3. Today we have a well-known panel of guest speakers, including Brandon from ZetaChain, Fig from Squid, Jason from Axelar Network, Derek from Moonbeam Network, Lane from Connext, and Colton from Prime Protocol. So before we start our panel, let's have everyone to introduce themselves and give a bit of info on the projects you're working on. We'll start with Brandon, then Fig, Jason, Derek, Lane, and Colton.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you for having us. I'm Brandon from ZetaChain. I lead product at ZetaChain. And just briefly, what ZetaChain is a new blockchain focused on interoperability and just improving developer as well as end user experience in general for particularly cross-chain applications. You can basically imagine ZetaChain as a blockchain and smart contracts platform that can connect to any other blockchain, something like Cosmos, but chain agnostic. So connecting to EVM, Bitcoin, non-EVM, L1s, L2s, anything like that. And it offers a full suite of tooling. So not only does it offer cross-chain messaging where you can send data and value natively between chains, but also omni-chain smart contracts. Those contracts are it's like an EVM layer that you can deploy a contract that can orchestrate assets on any different chain from a single place. So making that development process synchronous rather than asynchronous, which is kind of like two sides of the same coin of building for omni-chain or multi-chain.
Hey guys, I'm Fig. I'm one of the co-founders of Squid, which is the routing protocol on Axelar. So Axelar is a cross-chain protocol. Jason will introduce it later, which allows general message passing, and Squid is an application, an infrastructure built on top of it, which allows you to do any-to-any native swaps between chains. So in one click, you can get from any token on one chain to any token on another. And then we extend Axelar's general message passing so that you can use any token in your wallet to, say, purchase something on another chain in one click, or you can do staking across chains one click, anything like that. So great to be here.
Hey everyone, I'm Jason. I'm on the business development team at Axelar. As Fake alluded to earlier, Axelar is a cross-chain communications platform. We pride ourselves on being fully decentralized and permissionless. At a very high level, Axelar is a proof-of-stake chain that connects other blockchains. We're built using Cosmos SDK, and like any proof-of-stake chains, we have a validator set that secures the network. The validator set is fully permissionless. Anyone can spin up a validator, and as long as they have enough delegations, they can be part of the active set. The reason why we built Axelar like this is because we know proof-of-stake chains have been around for quite some time. We believe they're battle-tested and one of the most secure solutions out there. Axelar's message passing allows you to pass data in addition to just assets. So with that, the implication of this is now you can build all kinds of cool natively cross-chain use cases, Squid and cross-chain swaps being one of them. We also have Prime doing like cross-chain lending on top of Axelar platform. We now have hundreds of teams building all kinds of cool stuff on top of Axelar. And yeah, we're really excited about the cross-chain future.
No, I think it was me. I don't want to jump in front of you, Lane, but I think it was me. I'm Derek Yu. I'm the CEO of PureStake. PureStake is the primary contributor to the project Moonbeam. So Moonbeam is a layer one blockchain. It's part of the Polkadot network. So it's a so-called parachain on the Polkadot network. It is similar to ZetaChain. It is like a layer one smart contract platform that's focused on cross-chain use cases. So part of that, cross-chain capability comes from being part of Polkadot. We have access to things like XCM, which is the native cross-chain integration or messaging mechanism that's built into Polkadot. But as part of that focus, there also are a number of integrations of different kinds of cross-chain messaging protocols like onto Moonbeam. One of them is from the Axelar. Others that are in use on Moonbeam include things like Wormhole, Layer Zero, Hyperlane. There's kind of a family of different cross-chain protocols these days. And we do see quite a number of development teams that are starting to use these new capabilities to build interesting new cross-chain native protocols, different kinds of architectures, hub and spoke architectures, different kinds of things, which maybe we'll get into a little bit further on in the talk here.
Cool. And you were ahead of me. But all I remembered was I was after you. I'm Lane. I'm one of the co-founders of Connext. I do a lot of the protocol and research stuff on that side. What Connext is, we've been building interoperability systems for a while. Our first version was based on atomic swap, so mostly just moving funds around between different chains. However, we are releasing like a large upgrade that allows you to build a lot more expressive applications. The upgrade is called Amarok, and how that works and the shift we made is we shifted more towards a modular interoperability stack. This allows us to plug in all of the best-in-class messaging systems for different ecosystems directly under the hood, but while providing developers a unified interface to integrate against with and handling all the asset complexity at the top layers. So for example, if we're transferring from Arbitrum to Optimism, our messaging would rely on the native AMVs that connect through Ethereum. If we were interacting within the Cosmos ecosystem, we could easily plug in IBC. And then other ecosystems where folks like Axelar are very prominent, we could work with them as well.
Cool. And I think that leaves me as the last one to go. Hi, everybody. I'm Colton. I'm the founder of Prime Protocol, and we're a cross-chain borrowing and liquidity protocol. We're working with a number of the people here, including Moonbeam. We use a hub and spoke architecture to basically allow users to deposit on any blockchain and then take out a borrow on any other chain. We're using Axelar for our message passing. And our goal is to basically bridge the liquidity fragmentation problem that we see in DeFi as especially with respect to borrowing and lending, because right now, as everybody's using all these different blockchains and we're seeing more L1s and L2s pop up, if your collateral is spread over multiple chains, but you want to use that in a coordinated way, Prime gives you the ability to cross margin all of those positions and get the tokens that you want on the chain that you want at an interest rate that you know beforehand. So we're really excited about the cross-chain future, and that's what we're building for is specifically cross-chain DeFi.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing more about your backgrounds. We'll start with the questions, and the first one is pretty simple. Which aspects of a cross-chain interoperability interest you the most, and which of these are you currently tackling in the project you're working on? Let's keep the same order. So we'll start with Brendan, then Fig, Jason, Derek, Lane, and Colton.
Yeah, cool. I guess first of all, super cool to hear about everyone's projects. Good to meet you guys. For me, I think probably pretty general, but the three top of mind interop verticals, I guess, I'm interested in are identity, DeFi, and NFTs. I guess I'd say DeFi is probably the furthest along in terms of interoperability, like wrap tokens, early bridges, newer bridges built on cross-chain messaging and things like that. Generally, I guess like on a functional standpoint, have solved a lot of the problems in terms of like transferring value between different chains. I'd say for that, one of the biggest issues still kind of pervasive in the ecosystem is this concept of wrapping, where people are creating a large interdependency risk, just increasing over time. And that's something we're trying to solve with ZetaChain. So with our messaging, you can actually transfer native value between chains by trading against our native coin underlying that. So when you settle your transaction, there's no like wrapped token or vault that can be hacked. And then, yeah, I guess for NFTs and identity, it's a bit earlier. But I think, yeah, people are starting to build messaging based like omnichain NFTs and identity solutions. But I think the sort of solution we're positing is a way to orchestrate that from a single place, because it gets pretty complicated having to deploy contracts everywhere to have an NFT that can actually be on every chain. And even more so things like identity, where it would be nice to have a wallet or a username that you can actually transact across all chains from. That's mostly like a UX improvement, but I think it is a big, like kind of like a stepwise improvement if we can pull it off to where a lot of people will not have to really deal with multiple wallets, thinking about what network they're on for, I'd say, like 80% of use cases. Of course, there's always specialized use cases where you do have to worry about that. Yeah.
So I might go next. Yeah, I totally agree with all those points, Brandon. I think UX is probably what interests me the most. The proliferation of like all these new chains, all these L1, L2s, and alternate L1s is, I think, a bit of a response to trying to scale the ecosystem. So we didn't have enough block space on Ethereum, and everything got too expensive, and different communities popped up and wanted to build different things like in their own way. And what that's meant is now you have to go on a big research project just to be able to use a new chain, or you have to download a new wallet or swap assets or bridge them multiple times. And so cross-chain is all about, or interoperability is just creating like one single point where everyone can interact with everything. And that's sort of what we're trying to do. We've got developer tools and swaps so that you can, with like whatever wallet you have, you can buy an NFT on any chain in one click. It's all about like reducing the number of steps you need to do and like the number of places you need to look to get what you want. And yeah, I think wallets are going to really like once all of like our projects, I guess, like in this call, like become more well known and like adopted, then the wallets are going to sort of catch up to the point where you won't even know which chain you're interacting with. Potentially, you just go to the application and you'll be able to use it like no matter what funds you have in your wallet. A little bit like you'd have like your Visa card can work in any country. You don't need to do Forex anymore. You just tap your card and it does all the work in the background. Yeah, so I think UX is really the big thing. UX and scaling. I think the ability to scale is like what we're all trying to do so that crypto can find like mass adoption.
Yeah, for me, it's also user experience. And I think indirectly how more mature cross-chain technologies can really drive adoption for the next billion users. Like personally, I just remember when I first got into crypto and started exploring DeFi, how painful everything was. Like first trying to understand how do you bridge a token from your wallet to a different chain. And that was just so painful. And like later, I remember this one time where I had this position on, I think, Aave or Trader Joe, and it was almost about to get like liquidated. And I needed to like move some funds over from like ETH over to like top up my position so I don't get liquidated. And I look back to those moments and I can't imagine how we can have mass adoption when it's that difficult. The amount of risk that the user has to take on, the amount of exploration and curiosity that the user has to have before they can actually be confident and use a lot of these different DeFi protocols or just crypto in general. But I think like Axelar and our message passing really solves that by allowing talented developers like Squid and Prime and all these other teams to build these applications that combines various functions into one to create these like truly one-click experiences. I'm confident to say like some of these apps being built, right? Even like my mom could use it. Like she could easily download like a wallet from the app store, and by clicking a few buttons, she can now do all the things that before took me ages to figure out without any of the risk. So that's the future I'm really excited about, and hopefully this is what we're building here as a group is what's really going to take crypto to the next level.
Yeah, I have to agree with a bunch of the comments from previous folks. A couple I'd add though. I mean, one is if I take the developer perspective, is this kind of increased TAM or market? So historically you had to choose one chain and you were kind of limited to the users and assets on that chain. So I think cross chain is very attractive for developers to say, look, I can start in one place and then I can grow or kind of access users and like assets, different markets using cross chain. That's like a lot, it's kind of like how a regular business works, right? You might start in one city and then you expand to other cities and you'll grow a business. So I think that's kind of natural and a good scaling path for protocols. There is this point of efficiency also where, Colton kind of mentioned a little bit that by using cross-chain, you can be more efficient and more competitive, especially as compared to existing approaches that generally take a one chain at a time approach. You have like separate deployments on each chain. And so then you have like N number of islands. A protocol that is kind of acting as one protocol across all these chains is going to be inherently more efficient. So I think they're going to be quite competitive. But I would agree, I think, with several of the folks here on the call that the improved UX is probably for me like one of the most important things. And I think someone mentioned this word like chain agnosticism, right? So I do think that user experiences in the future will be more chain agnostic. Users will be like care less about like what quote chain they're on, right? I mean, they just want to get do the thing that they're trying to do. And so these cross chain techniques do allow this technique of, let's say, hiding more of the plumbing away from the user, right? You don't have to like explicitly be using bridges or other infrastructure to just interact with or to complete the flows that you're concerned with. You can kind of have this application-led experience that kind of hides away a lot of the infrastructural complexity. And so I think that's like a big gain on the UX side. And so yeah, for me, I think it's like the capabilities exist now, but the mental models need to evolve. Even take the example of Prime, where I think the mental model people have these days is you have to travel to get to anywhere, right? So it's like, oh, I need to go do something on mainnet. That means I have to go take my assets with me as luggage and go like take it. And then people are arguing over, do I take a train or a bus or whatever? But using these new techniques, there was a tweet thread I commented on, Colton, that you had sent out recently. It's almost like you can Zoom there, right? You can kind of virtually go wherever it is you need to be in this like much more liquid fashion. You don't actually have to travel. So but I think this is like a big like mental shift for people. So that mental shift is kind of happening as people understand like what they can do with these new cross-chain messaging technologies in particular.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm gonna take a bit of a step back and talk about why like we got into interoperability in the first place. And when Connext is like kind of an older organization within the ecosystem. So we started in 2017. And originally the goal was we want to be able to bring this technology to the masses. And of course, like, we were cute little spring children, didn't realize that was actually technically infeasible at the time. And that's how we kind of started getting into interop, but always following this goal of like, the only way this technology becomes useful is if it's accessible to millions of people across the world. And that has a lot to do with the UX, but it also has a lot to do with just the infrastructure that's available. So that's, to me, the most exciting part of interoperability. And you're able to build in these new ideas directly into the protocol. So you can even like have something fun where people like if you just look at cross-chain governance, right? You can have something where your DAO is secured by the like highest security chain, like something like mainnet, but all the votes are collected on something like Polygon. So people who can't afford to, put forth transactions on mainnet or they get priced out, they can still participate in these systems. And so I think that that's really important and like another aspect of accessibility outside of just the pure interop is important for that purely technologically. So those are the types of things that are really exciting to me. The UX, I think, will follow. But first, we're going to have to, see some mental model shifts between for the app developers before we start seeing the big UX shifts, because it'll be really exciting to see a multi-chain app that isn't just like Aave on 4 different chains. So that's partially why I'm really excited and what gets me all jazzed up. But the North Star for us has always been making this technology able to be used by millions of people. And there's like a lot of things that go into that.
I definitely agree with pretty much everything that's been said so far. I think the one thing that we're excited about at Prime is not just the improved UX, but like Derek was talking about, the financial utility that interoperability unlocks. Because coming from a more traditional finance background before I was in crypto, there's a lot of things that we do in crypto that are very inefficient, and I think they were originally done because of infrastructure constraints. And in order for people to actually use crypto in a serious way to do real finance on DeFi, you need interoperability to be able to seamlessly access different applications and different tokens on different chains, and be able to make all of those work together. And so I think that's what interoperability is really necessary for, is if you actually want to drive mass adoption, this technology has to be better than what currently exists. And crypto already has all of the decentralized pros, the permissionless, trustless, censorship resistant, transparent aspects that we all love. But there are some real things holding it back. And I think one of the biggest areas that's going to unlock this new wave of innovation is interoperability, because then everything's going to be more unified. There's going to be a better UX. And you're going to be able to do these things like cross margin your positions and actually move your money around in an easy way that's better than what traditional finance offers. So that's why we're excited about interoperability and what we're trying to add to the space with Prime.
Thank you. Now moving on to standards in interoperability and the cross-chain message solutions. Do you think we are still in time of experimentation when it comes to cross-chain interoperability frameworks, or clear trends are being set?
Yeah, I think my answer is a combination of both. I think there's still definitely a lot of room for experimentation. And yeah, I would say like functionally, again, we have solved a number of the problems in interoperability, particularly for financial applications, at least infrastructure-wise. I think there's still a lot to be done functionally for end users with that infrastructure. Where there's still a lot of iffiness is like what security models those solutions kind of take on. I think the like decentralization focus of like Axelar, ZetaChain is very positive change in terms of like comparing to early bridges where the middleman is effectively centralized, and just putting users at risk for a lot of the stuff they want to achieve. And then, in terms of like what we could do moving forward, or like what trends still need to be set is, I think, at least from my conversations with developers building on cross-chain messaging, it makes sense for a lot of applications, but a lot of applications, as I think Derek mentioned, might make a lot more sense in a more like synchronous building on a single chain that can orchestrate things, in that like it's kind of like two sides of developing. I think the latter, something that ZetaChain is working on with omni-chain smart contracts, is something that still needs to be explored by developers in terms of development patterns. And in my opinion, and I'm like slightly biased on this, I think a lot of the like larger applications, like cross-chain DEX and cross-chain lending, the like core primitives for the ecosystem of multi-chain will be built in that latter model over time. But of course, it really just depends on what applications need. But I would say messaging seems like something that is here to stay. Omni-chain smart contracts or some form of that, I think, still needs to be set.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think we're seeing like seeing standards form around the way contracts are called across chains. Like it's fairly straightforward. You have like most of the interoperability solutions have either a target address and then the call data you want to execute at that address. Like it's fairly standard, and also makes it what's great about that is it just makes it very similar to building on a single chain. You have, because in single chain code you find the call data that you want to execute an address, and it's the same thing across chain. If we've I think all done fairly well at abstracting that layer. And then I guess what we're working on at Squid is the token transfer layer, so standardizing that, because previously you'd have to swap and then bridge, and whatever bridge you used, then you have to swap into a native asset. It's all these steps, but since we have native to native swaps, then you have, similarly to on a single chain, you just transfer a token to the application you want to use, and then you call the contract. Similarly with us now across chain, you transfer the token, it gets sort of converted into a local currency, and then you call the contract. So I think that's maybe also another standard which will form. It's just token transfers across chain can be, cross-chain swaps can sort of be seen as token transfers as well. I think wallets will need to catch up. There's work to do there on standards. But security-wise, my favorite approach is having wallets which can submit transactions to every chain individually, which means you don't have this single point of failure. No one chain is controlling your assets on every other chain. It's your private key with your mnemonic is the only thing that can really steal your own assets. So I really like that model. Hopefully that sort of develops. And that's also in relation to the omni-chain contracts, which Brandon was talking about. Yeah, I might keep it short there.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think we're still in a time of experimentation when it comes to cross-chain solutions. And that just comes from my experience with speaking with hundreds of teams, right? After speaking with hundreds of teams, I'd say over 90% of these teams, and some of them, very talented, very sophisticated, know very little about actual differences and nuances of these cross-chain solutions. I think a lot of people still think cross-chain is just about asset transfers or traditional bridging. Just getting people to understand that, message passing exists, and now you have the ability to pass any payload across chains is, I think, for a lot of people, a new concept to wrap their heads around. But then, going a layer deeper, trying to teach people the differences between the different architecture and designs of different cross-chain messaging bridges and the trade-offs associated with that. I think that's an area that's still very much underappreciated. And we're only starting to get to that phase where people are like, okay, so it does the job, but what are the risks? How secure is this thing? Really trying to understand how does the architecture of this messaging infrastructure, cross-chain infrastructure affects how the way they build. I think we still don't have the right answer yet. And hopefully within the coming years or even coming months, people will have a better sense and be a little bit more educated on the subject, and we'll find, what is the best way to build.
Yeah, I I agree with that. And I guess for me, I would agree that we're still in the early days. And if you talk about standards, there are some emerging, but it is pretty early. A lot of times for a lot of these messaging systems, it really is like a byte payload. It's like, what most of them are optimized around, and then it's up to the developer to kind of decide what those bytes are. As was mentioned, this could be in an EVM context, this could be call data. And so we'll see. I'm kind of curious to see whether that's how an approach that assumes EVM like on both sides is something that kind of gets the most traction, or something that's a bit more generic. If I think about it, like even just simple things that are metadata, though, I fully expect to get standardized, right? So things like source and destination, people want to implement like filters on the messages, but right now there's like no standard way to do that. And so I do expect, just like with regular networking, it started out, there was a lot of different proprietary networking schemes, but over time, standards emerged, and then there was different kinds of infrastructure that could like work with those standards. And then, right now we're in this, if you were to use a network analogy, almost like IP level, but there's like, you need the TCPs of the world to be created, and then even higher order protocols like on top. I think that's going to come over time. But, right now we're in the raw byte array kind of, end of things, right? People are just putting call data like into these things to connect EVM chains, which makes sense. But, I think that as these layers standardize, there probably will be other protocols and technologies can add value, along those like different standard layers. And so, yeah, I kind of see it as like, it's like networking circa like 1985 or something, where there you have like different competing like networking technologies. And, like we'll probably see the rise of standards and, different kinds of intermediate like protocols like over time in this area.
Yeah, I would say we're pretty far away from standards in general. Like not standards at pretty much every layer of the interoperability stack. Like, yes, there are some commonalities. Like pretty much every smart contract interop development platform will be like, what's your recipient address and what's the random bytes array that you want to pass through? But what that represents between each one is completely different. And that's hardly ever the only two parameters that you're submitting to these smart contract calls. I think there's a lot of stuff that we've done that's pretty inefficient. That's a result of just having to get the problem done, like solved, and like everybody doing it in different ways. So for example, Axelar mints the AXL tokens, right, that you have to use on different chains. We have a similar version. Hop has a similar version of these tokens that we have to mint on like Optimism, Arbitrum, what have you, but those are never the tokens that you actually want to use. And so that's also like a big area where it's like, okay, maybe Squid could help sort this out and like set the standards here, but that's pretty bottom of the pyramid level stuff. And then even lower than that, you also have a bunch of like actively in development new patterns for passage messages around. Like one thing that is coming on the scene that will likely become pretty popular is ZK messaging and ZK bridges. So Succinct Labs has a demo, I think, from like Gnosis testnet to Goerli, and they use like ZK proofs to do consensus proving. That's not something that's standard, and that's likely going to have different subtleties that we're going to have to adopt or adapt to. I think then there's like something else like relayer fees. Like, okay, well, you want to do something on the other chain. How are you going to pay for it? There's so many different relayer fee schemes throughout the interop landscape that there's not really any standards there either. I think a lot of how the standards will get set depends a lot on who wins the market, but you do see teams coalescing around certain approaches that could lend itself to a standard, but right now are very non-standardized. So a lot of teams will levy fees on the source chain, but how they do that is completely different from protocol to protocol. So there's still a lot of room for improvement. And I think that I don't even think that best practices at a high level are established, let alone standards.
Yeah, I would agree that maybe standards is a strong word to use, especially when we're this early on. But I do think there are certain trends that we're starting to see emerge that I think will stick around. And I think it's probably going to happen first at the message passing layer and what we're thinking about for like consensus mechanisms. So we've already seen, the original bridges, some of them, like the ones from like ETH L1 to L2s, like that was, a more secure mechanism than some of these other ones, which were very centralized. Then we had, decentralized bridges and message passing protocols, sort of like what Axelar and ZetaChain are doing. And then you also have optimistic message passing, which I know Connect uses some of in like conjunction with some other mechanisms to make sure that you have a fallback. And I think those two are definitely more secure, obviously, than the centralized message passing solution. And I think you're going to see a few winners come out of each of those different categories. And so you'll have like a few big decentralized bridges, a few big optimistic message passers. And then you'll also have these like ZK message passers. And I think state proofs are also going to be something that people are using a lot. But each one has its pros and cons. And so I don't necessarily think that you're going to have one of those approaches completely dominate the market. Like state proofs are really cool, but there are certain chains that just weren't built with state proofs in mind. So it's going to be really hard to do that for Ethereum, even if it's easy to do it for Algorand or some of these newer chains that were actually designed with that intention. And so I think there's going to be perhaps standards that evolve around relaying because that's a competitive market. So that's maybe a situation where you have standards develop. But right now we haven't seen that happen yet.
Yeah, just one more thing to add on to that, because I agree that standards is a very strong term. Trends is definitely better. But you in interop, you're fundamentally going to be like interacting in a heterogeneous environment. So you should expect the pace or like the time at which standards are set to be much further in the future compared to where we are now. Especially because call data doesn't exist in the same way it does on the EVM on Solana, for instance. So if you have a bridge that has EVM's call data embedded and its assumptions, like what does Solana do about that if it becomes dominant? And so you're always going to have these different patterns that you have to adjust to that will lead to a lot of edge cases, even if a standard emerges.
Right. And that's definitely something that we've noticed as we've developed our protocol is we started with EVM because that was very easy to go between different chains. But for the non-EVM chains that we're looking to add in the future, we're either going to need to use like a mix of a couple different message passers or and even in our like core contracts, we need to adjust the way that we're storing and passing even like the addresses. So we're able to have an account that has persistent state across time that is associating to accounts that have completely different standards that they're using because the Solana account system is different than the address system in EVM.
Okay, now moving on to the last but very important topic, which is security. As interoperability between protocols continues to increase, more and more users will be able to seamlessly move assets and data across interconnected chains. With this growth, however, comes greater security risk. In your opinion, how can we build more secure cross-chain networks?
Yeah, I think we actually went over a number of these pieces in the last question, but I guess low-hanging fruit is eradication of a lot of the like early style of bridges. I think a lot still actually exist and are depended on for in certain blockchains and applications. So having a way to do native to native swaps rather than like building large like honeypot like bridges and vaults is a big one. The underlying trust models of whatever is transferring the messages or data or value or orchestrating that data and value between different chains. I think there are a lot of projects that boast a level of like trust minimization or just like blanket security, but in practice, certain projects might be adding more risk or creating certain dark patterns that could eventually put a lot of users' assets at risk, even if you're building on a like decentralized message passing solution. the chances that those solutions are compromised is basically the same chance that your project or those assets will be compromised. So increasing that is basically the focus of ZetaChain, and I think a lot of the projects here. Yeah, I think so. Like ZetaChain's approach is to build a way for developers and users to be able to transact value, and once you finish your transaction, those assets are not at risk. And I think that's probably the same as a lot of the projects here.
Yeah, nice segue into me. That's sort of the same thing we do. We swap native assets on one chain into a bridged asset and then bridge that across. Rather than the user holding that bridged asset on the other side, we then swap it into a native asset. I think that's what Brendan's talking about. They do too. And I think that reduces risk a lot because the user over time is holding an asset which is native to the chain, and the only time they're exposed to the bridge is while the transfer is happening, which can be super low, just a minute, or even into like the low tens of seconds. So I think that's a nice step towards improving security. I think Jason's probably going to go more into Axelar, so let him talk about that. But I think simplicity is another thing. Everyone here probably like feels me here, but like building cross-chain is super complex, and keeping it simple as possible is going to keep it more secure. So, from our perspective, that's why we're like just building on Axelar. We've just got like one interface that we need to think about when we're going across chain, and we can build around that. And we just keeping the use cases also as like small as possible. So we just focus on swaps, and then we expose sort of general functionality as well, so people can build on top of us, but like not taking on too much is I think a big part of it. And then of course, from our perspective, we chose to build on Axelar. We did months of research, and they were the most decentralized, generalizable protocol we wanted to build on, and really happy with the whole team. It's been like really cool to watch them build some features. I guess Jason, you should go take it away.
Thanks for setting me up, Fig. But at the cross-chain infrastructure level, we really do think security is a very complex problem, and it's quite multidimensional. So at Axelar, how we really think of it is in three ways. So it starts with the design. We believe the design has to be decentralized, and ideally in a manner that's been battle tested, which is why we built Axelar using a proof of stake blockchain. Then you always have to plan for like emergencies, right? So having safety or contingency measures is absolutely critical. So at Axelar, we've implemented rate limits, which basically puts a cap on the max amount of an asset could be transferred in case the network gets compromised. We've also set aside 5% of our token supply as an insurance fund. So, based on today's market value, that's around $25 to $30 million. When you combine these two, like rate limits with this insurance fund, we believe even in an emergency, we can make our users and partners whole. So letting them have peace that they're building on a secure, decentralized architecture, but also we have these emergency plans that covers them. And lastly, we want to have best practices when it comes to security policy, things like validator key rotations on a daily or regular basis, things like having continuous audits being done and bug bounties on platforms like ImmuneFi. At Axelar, we rotate our validator keys on a daily basis. We've done over 30 audits on the code and continuously do so. And we have 2.25 million bug bounty on ImmuneFi. So, when you combine all three elements of this, we really believe Axelar is the most secure cross-chain solution on the market.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's obviously security is a big thing, regardless of what you're building in the Web3 space, but more, especially so when it comes to interoperability. There's new threats for sure. Like, once you network your contracts, historically people considered threats that were in the same virtual machine, like as those contracts were deployed, but now the contracts are networked, right? So now there's different kinds of cross-chain messages that could invoke calls like on your contract, and you have to worry about, who's sending those. Are those like the right parties? Have they been tampered with at all? So there is kind of a new class of risks. And I guess I would point out that for a lot of like cross-chain architectures, the cross-chain messaging itself or the networking like is itself a new risk, right? So we see teams that might be working with more than one. They might say, hey, like we need, maybe there's a primary and there's a backup, like in case there's like some issue with like the primary. Similar in thinking to like, with people who have, providing networking services to a given location, right? You might have multiple network connections or something to provide redundancy and high availability. So I think, this is all, there's patterns from the past, but it is definitely complex. I think like some things that like I think will be quite helpful are these like very basic things that could be enabled with standards around even, let's say, source and destination, right? So being able to create like ACLs or filters like for messages, that's a request that we've gotten a lot of like from developers like developing on Moonbeam. And I think Jason, your points about like rate limits and these other kinds of control features, I think those are quite important too, right? It's like there's probably something anomalous happening if like, some massive amount of value is all being transferred in a short amount of time, or at least even if it isn't, that's probably noteworthy to like, to monitor for it, like wake someone up. And so I think, yeah, a lot of these like operational practices and tools are kind of catching up with like the new capabilities. And so I think even I see in this realm of like just even basic management tools, right? That a lot of them were designed for single chain contexts. So things like, we have an Etherscan like deployment on Moonbeam that's works quite well, but it is basically designed as a single chain solution. And so now if you're in like, let's say a multi-provider or multi-chain environment, just to trace like the interactions is like not all that easy, right? So providers, there's Axelar scan, so there's definitely provider specific solutions, but if you're dealing with like multiple providers, this gets pretty complicated to do. So there's definitely lots of work happening in that area, but I think that this is right now the developer experience for cross chain is like worse than single chain, and so there's like this catch up happening on the tooling. So that acts as an inhibitor, but at the same time, obviously, it's a big opportunity. And I do think that this is the direction in which things are moving.
Yeah. So, I mean, the last question was about standards, and I think that I'd like to temper my previous response by saying that there are some security standards that we should be enforcing as a community. And they're not necessarily like technical spec standards like the ERC20, for example, but they should be like communication standards and standards around like what you consider secure operations policies. And those I think you can actually, we have enough data. It's similar enough to like developing any smart contract system that you should be able to follow these procedures. And if you don't, like you should be kind of not treated as a secure option. I think that one of the big ones where we fall short as like the interoperability community is talking honestly about the security policies. Like a lot of the security dialogue happens around like the theoretical security model of a system, which can often be pretty strongly separated from the practical security of a system. So I'll give you an example with Connext v0. So Connext v0, based on atomic swaps, trust minimized between these two chains, right? However, if you take a look at the network as a whole, we do have like a single centralized point of failure, and that's the messaging system. So how do you pair users on both chains who want to switch funds? You need some type of messaging. Okay, great. Building this interop system, do we also want to solve decentralized messaging? Actually, no. And that would be like a really bad choice for the business because, we want to de-risk interoperability in our approach to that, not necessarily like, okay, great. And now let's use libp2p, which, is a different topic of discussion, or like invent a new decentralized messaging system. Like that's obviously not going to work. But that's something that's surfaced pretty high level in our docs. I think that type of all companies across the industry, especially in interop where it is so early and you have to be so agile, are making these types of trade-offs all the time around practical security. And I think that if you do not talk honestly about the implications for these trade-offs and like explain your reasoning for why you've made it, we're doing the whole industry a disservice. And we're in a super bad spot. Like the bull run was not great for overall perceptions of interoperability, security of interop and cross-chain stuff. So we really need to take that type of communication very seriously. In terms of like practical, technical security standards and things that I think could improve the industry, rate limits is a great one. One other great thing about like interop is you've got this nice generally period in the middle where before you've executed something on the destination chain, you have information from the source chain. Doing some invariant checking there before you forward on the message or the transaction or whatever, incredibly important. So those are two like practical design choices that you could integrate into, but I think the more impactful one would just be standards and like the community self-enforcing standards around how we communicate about the security trade-offs of our systems. Because yeah, like generally most bridges, what's the biggest security weak point? It's not going to be like, oh, compromising all of the validators and the POS. It's going to be like, well, who has your upgrade keys? And it's going to, and that may not apply. It's not a dig or anything. It's just an example of like where the gap between what we talk about versus what the actual risk is.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I agree with that. And I also think if you look at most of the bridge hacks that happened, it wasn't that the consensus mechanism was ever hacked. It was always that, you know, there was some small bug in like the token vault on the other side that somebody was able to like start replaying things to, or something like that. So I definitely think, yeah, security, a lot of it comes down to not just the consensus mechanism, but also whether the integration is done correctly and in a secure way, to prevent those kinds of attacks. I think particularly with our application, our like attack surface area increases with each, you know, new chain that we add. And like, if we, you know, add a new chain that requires like us to add a new message passer, that's also increasing our risk. And so we need to be like really diligent about that. And that's, you know, part of the reason why we, you know, are trying to minimize, you know, the number, like, you know, using Axelar for all of our EVM chains, I think is, you know, a solution that we're pretty satisfied with the security, specs of, and we think has, you know, gone through a lot of audits and they've been pretty diligent about that. And that's not to say that like any of the other protocols on here also haven't done a good job and also won't be successful in that respect. But, you know, I think there are other protocols out there that aren't on this call that, you know, like anonymous protocols where you're not actually sure really what's going on or like who has the keys. I think that, you know, stresses me out a bit. That's still something that people are using. So I think that that's something that we're going to need to reckon with, is making sure that, yeah, we have standards for being transparent about how are these protocols able to be upgraded, who's upgrading them, what's the like, is there any sort of like oversight on that upgrade to make sure that you're not accidentally putting in a zero address where you shouldn't be, that allows people to, you know, bypass something. So yeah, I think in order to build more secure cross-chain networks, a lot of it is just process and making sure that we're diligent about the small things that have resulted in all of these hacks that we've seen so far.
Okay, thanks everyone for all your insights, and thank you everyone for tuning in. If you'd like to find out more about ZetaChain, Squid, Axelar, Connext, Moonbeam, or Prime Protocol, you'll find the links to the social in the video description. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks,
very
everyone.
much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody.